Alright, so this is going to be the final product for our final app in this course. The idea is that we're going to have a database, a SQLite database that we are going to feed information to and retrieve information from. We'll retrieve the name, email, and food of those people. We're going to have two labels. Now these are two labels. They are not buttons, they are labels. But we're going to set it up so that we can create like little mini event handlers upon these labels, so such that we click on the label, it'll go to a new page. So in this case, we'll have a few items on a table to retrieve that information. If I click on Mr. Spock, we'll say that his favorite food is Klingon ale, which we know isn't true. But if we go back, I click on this other label, it'll show a new page that has a picker, and we'll say that Mr. Spock likes, or Mr. Scott likes shrimp. Right, show his favorite food, we'll hit back. But again, these are labels, and we're going to look at something called touch events that will allow us to touch any part of the screen and be able to invoke some sort of action. And we're going to go back to storyboards this time around, and we're going to use segues to go to the next page. But you might be wondering, how do we create a segue and go to for a label and go to another page with it? And we're going to learn how to do segues in code this time around. So there's a lot of things we're going to learn in this app. There's a lot of things we're going to bundle together into this app in particular, and it should wrap up this course on iPhone app development. So first thing we're going to do is we're not going to create a new project just yet. We'll get into it in a moment. What we're going to do is we're going to open up the terminal. And so what we're going to do here is so either terminal or console. But what we're going to do here is we're going to open up the terminal and actually create the database file first. That's going to be our first job. So there are instructions with the code that I've uploaded to Slate, and you'll see those instructions written down. But what we're going to do is we're going to do those instructions step by step together. So we're going to take advantage of a program called SQLite that is a command line program that will allow us to create our database. Now, you've probably worked with MySQL and Oracle and thus far in building your databases. The SQL language syntax is a bit different for SQLite than it is for those other database engines. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off with an open terminal. Note where you are in the whole grand scheme of things. We're going to type in SQLite and a file name. So I'm going to call mine mydatabase.db. So we're going to call it mydatabase.db. And if we hit enter, sorry, we're going to type in SQLite 3. Okay, so we're going to try SQLite 3. So we're going to type in SQLite 3 mydatabase.db. And you should see a prompt that says SQLite with a little arrow. Now, if you don't see it, then you probably mistyped the command and you want to try again. Because if you still have your regular prompt, then there's a problem. So the idea behind this is that we're going to now create our database using command line. Now with MySQL and Oracle and all the other database engines, you could actually do stuff by command line instead of using programs like Workbench or phpMyAdmin or whatever. But you could actually create your database in the command line like this. So the first thing we're going to do is create a table. Now in our table we're going to have 4 columns. We're going to have an ID column, we're going to have a name column, an email column, and a food column. And so we're going to go ahead and create the table by saying create table. And we're going to call this table entries. So note the spelling of your table, because when we actually do our queries, our database queries in code inside our app, then we want to make sure we have the table name correct. So we're going to say create table called entries, and in round brackets, we're going to list out our columns. So our first column will be the ID column. So I'm going to say ID. And this will be an integer. It'll also be a primary key. And it'll also be not null. The second column, we're going to call it name. Now you're probably thinking varchar from Oracle. You're probably thinking varchar. No, we don't use varchar in this language. We're going to use the word text. And so we're going to do that with the remaining columns as well. So we're going to say name is text. We're going to say email is text. And we're going to say food is text. And we can close off the round brackets, put a semicolon at the end of it, and hit enter. And if you see nothing come up, that's a good thing. So no news is good news, which means that it actually accepted the command. So we have create tables entries, ID, primary key, name, text, email, text, and food text. Once we have our table, we could be done at this point, but it's actually best to maybe insert a row of data, because our first step when we actually write our code is to actually retrieve some data. We're not going to try writing to the database right away. We're going to try and retrieve from the database first so that we can actually work with it. So we're going to try inserting into this table by running one little command. We'll say insert into entries, and in round brackets we'll actually put our values. So first one will be null, because we want this to trigger an auto increment. The problem is we can't put 3 columns in because it's a 4-column table. So we have to use the word null here to trigger that auto increment for the ID column. And we'll see that in a moment. We'll see what the result is for the ID here. And then for me, no app is complete without a Star Trek reference. So I'm going to use, in single quotes, Jim Kirk as my name, jim@kirk.com as the email, and I'll say pizza as his favorite food. So close off the round bracket, hit semicolon there, and hit enter. All right, let's try it again. So the insert is actually insert into entries values null Jim Kirk, jim@kirk.com, and pizza. There we go. So now we have one row of data inside our table. And we can do a simple select statement to verify that it's there by saying select star from entries. And we should see our line of information there. So 1 is our column, which is the column ID there. So that first column there is telling me that it auto-incremented to 1. We have Jim Kirk, jim@kirk.com, and pizza as our 3 pieces of information there. And once we have that, we can go ahead and quit the file and move on to our code. But the way we quit is to say .quit. And that brings us back to our command prompt. And so now we're ready to use this database inside of the app. All right, so now that the database is done, note where it's located. For me, it's in my home directory. So I'm going to bring it into the project afterwards. But what we're going to do now is we're going to create our project and start by creating some of the views in the app, at least to get started with that. So we'll start off with File, New Project. We'll have Single View Application. I'm going to call this project Database Intro. So everything else would be the same. Objective-C, Universal App, Core Data, Unit Tests, include UI tests. We'll hit Next. And we'll give it a home. All right. So we have our typical files that we created here, and unlike the last two apps, we are not going to delete the main storyboard. We're going to use storyboards this time around. So we're leaving nib files alone. We're going to go back to nib file to storyboards. So we're going to start by creating our groups. So we'll start off with a new group. We'll say view controllers for this new group. We're going to create another new group, which is special classes. We're going to create another new group, which will be nibs. And one more new group, which will be database. And we'll drag app delegate H&M into special classes. We'll drag view controller into the view controllers. Main storyboard and launch screen into nibs. All right, so we have our files in place. We have our groups created. The first step is let's bring the database file into the project. So we have to note where the database file is in our computer. And again, like I said, I put mine in my home directory. Chances are you have it there as well. So we're going to right-click on database and say add files to database intro. And we're going to navigate to where it is. So I'm going to find my file. And so now I have my database.db here. And at this point, once we have our database file in our project, let's start off with dealing with the storyboard stuff and get the GUI out of the way. So we'll start off with launch screen. And we'll configure it to be an iPhone 5 screen. So view controller, making sure that my attributes inspector is highlighted. My size will be iPhone 4-inch. Orientation portrait. I'll put a little message that says loading. So look for a label. And give a bit of color there. Let's change the font up this time. Instead of using the boring system font, let's choose something different. I'm thinking marker felt. Maybe make it wide, and let's increase the font. Looks a little neat. So we have a little loading page up and running here. Hit Command S to save. So I'll put the word loading into the storyboard, move over to main storyboard, and start configuring this page. So we have our home page. Go to view controller. We'll say our size again is iPhone 4-inch. Orientation portrait. And let's put our stuff on the screen here. So we'll start off with some labels. We'll say database intro. I'm going to use the same font again. So marker felt. wide. Change the color. Increase the font size. See how big we can get it. And a couple more labels down here. And this will be centered. So this one will say view database using table. And we'll use another label here. We'll say view database using picker. Check the screen here. This looks a bit small. Yeah, it is a 4-inch. Huh. Maybe it's the font size I'm using. So we have our labels. Let's drag a few more labels into place here. We're going to have name, email, and food be our labels here for each item that we want to enter stuff into. So we'll say name. Email. And food. Notice I'm right justifying them. So we have all of our labels in place. Now we can bring in some text fields. So we have our 3 text fields to go along with name, email, and food. Finally, the only thing we have left to put on is a save button on the screen. So we'll look for a button. And make it a bit bigger. Put the word save there. So notice this is the only button we have here. Save. And the rest are labels. So these, even though we're going to make them act like buttons, they really are just labels. And we're going to have it so that these labels are clickable. So I'll do Command S to save. And that's it for the first page. We're going to bring in a couple more pages here that we want to use. So let's go ahead and add the other page here. So we're going to say view controller. And we'll bring in a second page. Throw it on there. Of course, it's a humongous size, so we're going to have to resize it down to an iPhone 4-inch. Use portrait orientation. All right, place a bit parallel to the first page. I'm going to bring another page in as well. Just throw it there. It'll be another iPhone 4-inch portrait as well. And I'll put that just below the other new page that we created. So as you can see, it's barely visible, but we have our home page here, we have a new page, and another new page here. So you have 3 pages in total for this app. What we'll do is we'll put stuff on the other 2 pages first, and then we'll link everything together. So we'll start off with this page that's adjacent to my home page. Put on a nav bar. So look for a nav bar there. I'll throw that on. Let's go for the text, I'm going to say save data. And maybe change the bar tint to be that same brownish orange. Look for a bar button item. For our back button, put back as the keyword. So we have back here. The last thing we'll add here is a table view. But we're not going to connect up the table view just yet. So table, let's look for a table view. And we will fill it up with the rest of the screen. So our table view is here. Now, don't forget, we're going to connect data source and delegate for the table view after, not yet, because we just want to get this app to be up and running, be able to focus on page navigation for now. We'll focus on the table methods later. So, what we want to do here is now move down to the other page, and we'll populate the items for those as well. Okay, so let's go to the other page and actually do the same thing again. So we're going to look for a navigation bar. I'm going to put save data again for this too. Change the bar tint to that same color. And put a back button on it, so bar button item. With the word back. And this time just put a picker on. This is your first little jump into pickers. The nice thing about this picker is that you can actually resize it width-wise now, which is new for iOS 9. 9, maybe 8. I'd have to double check that. But in the past, your pickers were a fixed width and fixed height, and you couldn't really do much about it. Now you can actually resize the picker to be a size that you want. So we're going to keep this picker right here. We know, it's not really the best looking page, but the idea for this activity is to focus on learning how to do a picker here. So we now have our pages, all of our GUI stuff completed, but we need to add in the view controller objects that are going to be linked to these second and third pages here. So we'll do Command S to save the storyboard. We're going to add some new files to the view controller. So we're going to right click on view controllers, say new file. We're going to say iOS source Cocoa Touch class. We'll hit next. Now it'll be a subclass of UI view controller. Language is Objective-C. And I'm going to call this one table view controller. So this will be for the table page, the page with a table on it. So I'm going to call it table view controller. I'm going to hit next and give it a home. So I created my table view controller.h and table view controller.m. And I'm going to right click and add another new file here under view controllers. I'm going to right click and add another new file here under view controllers. So iOS source Cocoa Touch class. Hit next. This one's going to be called picker view controller because it has the picker on the page. So again, subclass of UI view controller, language is Objective-C, no nib file this time around. Hit next, give it a home. And so now we have picker viewcontroller.h and picker viewcontroller.m. So we have all the files that we need for now. We're going to be adding more files to this project. This project can actually grow a lot bigger. So what we're going to do here is connect these two view controller objects to the storyboard. So we're going to click on main storyboard. We'll start with the picker page, highlighting view controller, switching over to identity inspector. We want this to be picker view controller. We want to subclass it to picker view controller. And then if we move over to the table, we're going to hit view controller and choose table view controller. So table view controller there. So now we have our pages all subclassed. They're all ready to go. The only thing left is to connect them and create segues for them. So we'll start off by getting a segue to connect to these pages here. Now, we're not going to connect them with buttons, so really there's no way to connect these labels as segues for these items. What we're going to do is we're going to look at our little document outline here on the side, and we're going to connect it this way. So we want to create segues from the view controller, the home page, to each of these pages here. So we're going to mouse over the word view controller there next to the yellow circle, hold down the control button, drag to table view controller, let go, and say present modally, and it'll create a new modally segue to table view controller. We'll do it one more time. So mouse over view controller, hold down the control button, drag to picker view controller, and choose present modally as well. So we have two segues created. We have one going from the home page to the table page and one going from the home page to the picker page. But we're not done with configuring the segues just yet. Now we're actually going to take a step deeper into segues and look at how we can customize the segues for what we need. See, what we're going to do now is we're going to actually call these segues not in GUI, but in code. So we actually have to wait to actually figure out which segue we want to call. And so we're going to have to dig deep into the configuration settings of each of the segues themselves. So I'm going to close this up because we can actually click on the segues here to work on that, but we're going to, because of space reasons, I'm going to close this up. Notice that there's a little arrow that's created between pages for each segue. So if I click on this little arrow, it turns blue, and I can actually configure the segue itself by going to the Attributes Inspector, and I'll see Storyboard Segue. And so this is now my way of configuring this segue here. So if I click on that segue and I see the first option here is identifier, I'm going to actually give this an ID. We haven't done this yet, so we're actually give this an ID now because we're going to retrieve the segue in code. We need to have an ID to work with. So I'm going to say home segue to table. All right. So this is my table page. So I'm going to say home segue to table. That'll be the ID for this particular segue. Now, if I move down to the picker page, I'll have another segue there as well. But before I do, there's other options here we'll bring up. So there's class. So we can actually subclass a segue. We can create our own customized segue, get into like core animation and create our own customized segues for doing things. So we can really jazz up the app. What we want to do here is go to transition, which is the last option. So instead of default, I'm going to use like cross dissolve. But you can actually play around with the different transitions available at your disposal. So I'm going to use cross dissolve for mine. And then I'm going to move down to the other segues. So I'm going to move around a little bit. Here I find another arrow. So this arrow is connected to the picker page because we see a little arrow pointing to the picker view controller page. It has its own set of attributes. So I'm going to start off by calling this one home segue to picker. So this is my other segue, home segue to picker. Right? And I'm going to choose this transition to be consistent. I'm going to choose cross dissolve. but we have different transitions there. So I'm going to choose cross dissolve for this one. And so now at this point, we're done with the storyboard for now. Now I can write some code related to this. So I'm going to do Command S to save. Okay, so now that we're done with the storyboard for now, we'll come back and add more to the storyboard, but let's get into coding. And what we're going to do is we're going to start off in viewcontroller.h and .m and write our code there. Right. So inside the header file for viewcontroller, we're going to create a bunch of variables that we're going to work with. But before then, because we have text fields to work with, we have to bring in the text field delegate so it can cancel out the keyboard. So we're going to say UI text field delegate. Right? And then we can bring in our variables. So now we could say IB outlet, UI label. I'm going to call this one LBL table. I'll say IB outlet, UI label. I'll say LBL picker. I'll talk about these two labels in a moment. And then we have the three text fields. So we'll say IB outlet, UI text field. Call this one TB name. IB outlet, UI text field. TB email. IB outlet, UI text field. TB food. Then we'll do the property declarations for each of these. Okay, and so we have all our variables in place, but what we did here is we created two extra IB outlets here, both of them UI labels. So the text fields we can understand. We're going to retrieve data from the text fields, so we created variables for those, so that's understandable. But all of a sudden, we're creating variables for the labels, which we haven't really done. The only time we would have created a variable was when we want to update the text in the label, but we're not doing that here. We are creating variables for these labels because these are going to be related to the two labels we created at the bottom of the screen. One that said view table or view data using table and view data using pickers. So we're going to connect those to those labels. But the only reason we are creating these variables is because we want to know the attributes or the dimensions of and the location of those two labels. That's the only reason. And we'll understand more about why in a moment. But for now, this is our header file. So we're going to save that. And then we can move over to viewcontroller.m and start by synthesizing these variables. So we'll start by synthesizing. LB picker, LB table, TB name, TB food, and TB email. And what we're going to do first is let's get the text field method out of the way. So we're going to say text field should return. So we'll say bool return type. And then text field should return. Just to get that canceling method out of the way that we need. And so inside of it we'll say text field resign first responder. And we'll return no. So we're getting that canceling method out of the way. Another method we can get out of the way is the unwind method. So now that we're back in the storyboard world, we need that special method to unwind to this home page. So we have to create that other method. It's an IB action called unwind to this view controller. Its argument is of type UI storyboard segue star. All right, so we have this. So we got these two methods out of the way. So these are nothing new. We've done these quite a few times already. So we're just getting them out of the way because we know we're going to need them eventually. What we want to do now is create another new method, and this method involves getting the label to do something upon being touched. See, there's touch events that are built into view controllers, and they're outside of this whole concept of touching a button to get the button to do something or whatnot. But the idea is that we have the ability to touch any part of the screen and have something happen upon touching that part of the screen. For our intents and purposes, we have those two labels at the bottom of the screen. We want to set it up so that if we touch those two labels at the bottom of the screen, then it will go to another page. So I'm going to create another method right below here, void return type. Start by typing the word touch, and you see a bunch of methods pop up here. Each of these methods is a touch method. Its purpose is to handle touching the screen directly and doing something directly with the screen. It's useful for, say, for example, gaming, where if you want to touch a part of the screen to invoke an action on your character, you could use these methods. But each of these methods actually serves a different purpose. The main ones we care about are touches began, touches ended, and touches moved. Touches began occurs when you actually touch the screen. You put your finger down on the screen, this method gets executed. Touches ended is different. It serves the same purpose where like if you touch the screen it does something, but actually this one only gets executed upon letting go of the screen. So you put your finger on the screen, nothing happens. When you let go of the screen, that's when this happens. That's when touches ended gets executed. And the last one, touches moved, is when you drag your finger across the screen. So those are the three ones we care about. I mean, there's other ones like touches canceled is a strange one to wrap your head around. But the idea with touches canceled is that, if you're in the middle of a touch event like begin or ended or moved, and all of a sudden say the app crashes or the app needs to close or the phone shuts off, this is a method that would be invoked to clean up things that are happening. So this isn't really a cancel touch. There's no such thing as a cancel touch. It's more for when the system wants to shut down or something like that. So we're going to choose touches began. And we're going to start off with getting or figuring out what part of the screen was touched. Now, if you look at the arguments here, it says NSSet. So we talked about collections before. We talked about NS arrays, NS dictionaries, and I did mention NSSet very briefly, just to say that we're going to get into it. The interesting thing about NSSet is that it's like an array, but it's unordered. There's no order to this group of items. And this is the main application for it, where when you touch the screen, you're not touching one pixel on the screen. You're touching like maybe a few hundred pixels, right? Because our fingers are very thick, right? So it's impossible to touch one pixel and only one pixel. So when we touch the screen, we're touching a bunch of pixels, and we're getting those pixels back in the form of this variable called touches. So we want to retrieve just one pixel. That's our first goal. Just one pixel out of those group of pixels is good enough. So first thing I'm going to do is retrieve just one pixel. So I'm going to say UI touch. I'm going to call it touch is equal to touches any object. So this says go into this set of pixels, pull out any pixel. You randomly send it back to me. Doesn't matter what. Just send me back a pixel from this set. Now I need to convert this touch object to something I can work with, something like an XY coordinate. Now, XY coordinates, we talked about CG objects up until now, and I mentioned how very powerful they are. We can do a lot of things with CG objects, and we're going to learn today just how powerful they are and how much they save ourselves a lot of headache. So first thing we're going to do is take this touch object, convert it to an XY location. So we're going to use CG point, because CG points hold XYs. I'm going to call it touch point. And notice I am not using a star next to touch point. Notice I'm not using a star. Any CG object you work with is not a pointer. It doesn't use stars in front of it. They're very special structures that don't require any sort of instantiation. They're more like data structs like in C. So we're going to say CG point, touch point. We're going to take our touch object and convert it by using a method called location in view. We'll pass in self.view. What this does is says, hey, look at where we are in the grand scheme of things. Convert this into an XY location with respect to the screen that we're currently on. So we know the screen that we're currently on, we're going to pass in self.view, the current view controller's view itself, and we know it encompasses the entire screen. As opposed to maybe it could encompass just half the screen. Like if this is an iPad, we can actually split views into pieces. So we're basically saying, convert this touch object into an XY location. Now, we want to see if this point exists inside either of those two labels. So we're going to retrieve those labels. So we're going to say cgrect. Now, if you recall from the last app, we use cgrect inside our site cell object. And we're going to bring in site cell into this app as well eventually. Every UI object has a variable called frame. Frame has a cgrect object. Frame is a cgrect object in which it houses the x, the y, and the width and the height of that particular UI element. Right? So it has x, y, width, and height for that UI element. Now, what we did was we created those two UI label variables because we don't have to go into the storyboard and figure out, hey, where is this x, y, width, and height for this particular screen? So we could hard code it. It's a very painful thing to do. So why do that when we can create a variable, connect it up in the storyboard, and let the storyboard automatically figure out where its location is? So we're going to say cgrect. I'm going to call this one table frame. So it's the label that has the message saying go to the table page essentially. It's equal to lbl table.frame. So we're going to get the frame variable for lbl table. We'll do the same thing again. We'll say cgrect. Call this one picker frame. It's equal to lbl picker.frame. So now we have the two frames for the picker label and the table label, the two labels that we want to check to see if it was touched. And so at this point, we have the XY location of the point that was touched. We have the two frames, the XY width and height of the two labels. We want to see if that point intersects with either label. If it does, we'll invoke a segue to go to either one of those pages. If not, we'll just pretend it never happened, leave the method, right? So we might have in the past used an if statement that would say if the x is greater than this frame's x, and if it was less than this frame's width, and if the y was greater than this y variable and less than the height of this label, then we would do this. We have one giant if statement to do it. We can reduce that down to one simple method that has been created for us. And the thing about CG objects is that there's a ton of different transforms and functions that are available at our disposal for working with different intersections, different operations. There's so many things available for us, which is what makes it very powerful. So I'm going to say if cgrect contains point. I can check to see if a point exists inside a rect with just one simple method call. So I'm going to pass in, I'll start with the table frame, so table frame, and pass in touch point. All right. Now, if it's the case where this pixel exists inside that label, for the one that says go and view this data using a label, then let's call that segue. So here's how we call a segue in code. We're going to say self perform segue with identifier. So now we need that ID that we wrote out in the storyboard. That ID, we called it, it's a string variable. It was called home segue to table. And be very careful of the spelling. Like the nib files from the last couple of apps, we had to be very careful of the nib file names that we provided to the nib file when we were instantiating a view controller object. Same idea here. If we're going to call a segue, we've got to be very careful of the name of the segue. So we want to make sure that it lines up nicely. So we're saying home segue to table. So home segue with identifier. We're going to use home segue to table. The second argument is just self. Let's do that one more time, and then we can give this a try. We can connect everything up and give it a try. So we're going to say if cgrect contains point, we'll say this time picker frame. We'll pass in touch point. Do the same thing. Self perform segue with identifier. This time it's home segue to picker. Sender is self. So at this point, the touch method is done. Now, at this point, the only thing left is to connect everything up and try this out. So we have our point. We're checking to see if it exists inside a label, so we can go ahead and do that. So we can save this file. We can go over to the storyboard and connect everything up. So I'm going to highlight the connections inspector. I'm going to start off with the two other pages, because we tend to forget this typically, is the back button. Let's start off with the back button and actually connect it to the exit icon. So I'm going to mouse over back, hold down control, connect it to exit. Try it again. And choose unwind to this view controller. For the other picker page, I'm going to mouse over the back button, held down control, drag to exit, and say unwind to this view controller. So my two back buttons are connected. My segues are connected. The only thing left is to connect everything up here in this home page. So I'll start by highlighting the yellow circle here. Let's look at what's here that has to be connected. So LBL picker will get connected to this guy. LBL table to this one. TB email to this. TB food. TB name. But we're not done yet, because we want to make sure the keyboard cancels. So we're going to click on each individual text field, connect delegate to the view controller for all three text fields. Alright, so all three of my delegates for each of the three text fields are connected. And so now we can give this a run. So I'm going to choose iPhone 5S and run this thing. Save our loading page. And we have our home page. Now, let's just focus on navigating. So if I click on View Database using Picker, it goes to the next page. If I hit back, click View Database using Table, and it goes back. So we have our page navigation out of the way here. All right, so now that we have our storyboard configured, let's move into writing some code for the data itself. Now, what's going to happen is that we're going to save this data into a database. We're going to retrieve this data from a database. And what we're going to do is we're going to take this data of name, email, and food, and we're going to have it inside a custom object, first of all. Now, that custom object will be an array of those custom objects. Depending on when we retrieve stuff from the database, however many rows there are on the table, we're going to retrieve and instantiate that many data objects to hold name, email, and food. So the first thing you have to do is create a new object. And so we're going to right-click on Special Classes, and we're going to say New File, and we're going to say iOS Source Cocoa Touch Class. We'll hit Next. And this will be a subclass of NSObject. So just a generic object. And I'll call this one just Data. So class is called Data, subclass of NSObject, language Objective-C. Hit Next. And give it a home. And so we now have data.h and data.m. So what we're going to do here is we're just going to take a similar approach to what we've done in the past. We're going to create variables. We're going to create a constructor to pass those variables in, and that's about it. So we have three variables in the table of the database table, name, email, and food. So we want to have three variables inside this object of NSString type for name, email, and food. So I'm going to say NSString name, NSString email, NSString food. I'm going to create property declarations for all three. All right, so we have our name, email, and food just like we have name, email, and food inside our database table. Okay, so just those items are what we're going to work with. And so we'll leave the header file for now. We'll come back to it in a little bit because we still have one more thing to add to it. So move over to data.m. We'll synthesize all three. Name, email, food. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a constructor to initialize this object and pass in those three items to that object. So we're going to start off with a method ID return type. Call it init with data. We'll pass in NSString n for name. Label will be the email. It'll also be NSString e, and then the food, NSString f. So we're using n, e, and f for name, email, and food. So our constructor, we'll start off with our usual conventions for the constructor. We'll say if self equals super init. And we'll return self. Now, all we want to do here is we want to save the name, email, and food that was passed in. So we'll just say self set name to n. self set email to E, self set food to F. So now we have an object that will save our name, email, and food for us. Now what we want to do is we want to put this method inside the header file so we have access to it. So we'll copy this. We'll paste it inside the header file. And we'll save this. Okay, so now that we're done the data object, now we can dig into the hardest part of this app, and that is to actually write the code to interact with the database. So we're going to be using a lot of C code here to be able to do this. The first thing you have to do is bring in a couple of frameworks that will help us interact with the SQLite database itself. So we're going to go to project settings. And we're going to scroll down to the bottom of the screen, and you'll see an option here that says linked frameworks and libraries. And so this allows us to bring in external frameworks and libraries to interact with. So for example, suppose you want to do some Facebook interaction. You could bring in the social kit here, or you could download Facebook's SDK and bring that in here as well. But then that allows you access to the external functionality created by somebody else into your project. So, for example, if I click on the plus sign here, and I can use the minus sign to get rid of stuff, you may see here's a bunch of stuff like Audio Toolbox, AV Foundation, AV Kit. So when you get into sounds and stuff, you probably want to take advantage of these ones. Address Book, if you're going to interact with the address book. Cloud Kit, Core Audio, Core Data, Core Graphics, a ton of different frameworks available at our disposal, a ton of different kinds. I'm going to type into the search bar SQL. And a couple of libraries come up, libsqlite3.tbd and libsqlite3.tbd. I'm going to actually take both. And in older versions of iOS, these might have been .dylib for dynamic lib. For some reason, Apple changed the file extensions between iOS 7 and 8, I believe, somewhere around then. But now we have the SQLite libraries available to work with. So now we can actually go ahead and start writing some code. So what we're going to do is move over to appdelegate.h and actually create some variables to work with. So we're going to do the majority of our database interaction inside appdelegate. Then what we're going to do is whenever we wanted to insert to a database or retrieve from a database, we'll call the methods that are inside appdelegate from our view controllers. A similar approach we took to the NIV files in the last two apps, where we called those methods that were created inside the appdelegate from the view controller. So similar approach there as well. So first thing you have to do is actually create these variables. So we're going to start off in appdelegate.h and create the variables we need. So first thing is we're going to create a variable for our database name. So it's NSString. We're going to say database name. And then we're going to say NSString database path. And what we're going to do is we're going to create an array for the people that are listed in our database. So whatever we retrieve, we're going to save into an array. We're going to use an NS mutable array because we're going to be overwriting this array over and over and over again. So we're going to say NS mutable array, call it people. And we'll do our property declarations for all three. We're done with this header file for now. We'll come back to it and we'll add more to it as we create methods. We'll add the method declarations here. What we're going to do is we're going to start by synthesizing these variables. So we'll move over to appdelegate.m. We'll synthesize database name, database path, and people. We're going to use a couple of pound pragmas here to really organize our code. So I'm going to start by doing a pound pragma here because there's going to be a lot of methods to work with and a lot of code to jump between when we're navigating our files. We're going to say pound pragma, mark, I'll say app methods. And above it, I'll say pound pragma, mark, database methods. All right. What we want to do now is start off inside did finish launching with options. And what we're going to do here is set up our paths and our location of our app or of our database. So first thing we'll do inside did finish launching is to say self.people ns mutable array alloc and init. The next thing we'll do is set the database name variable. So we're going to say self.database name is equal to, and we're going to use our same file name. So in this case, we called it mydatabase.db. Of course, if you use a different file name, that should be the file name you use here. And now what we want to do is we want to figure out where this file should go. So here's the thing. We have our file here in the project, but on the device or simulator, it's not going to be in that same location. The way it's going to work is that you're going to, on first loading this app for the very first time, like let's suppose you download it off the App Store and you have it, what happens is that you have the app downloaded, this database file is going to be inside the app bundle file. So the actual app file is going to be located somewhere in there. What we want to do is we want to take that file out, rip it out of that file, and actually copy it into a place like, let's say, our My Documents folder on the phone. So the phone actually has a file system, just like Windows. And so on Windows, you're accustomed to seeing like My Documents, My Music, My Photos, and so on, right? And you can actually see those files, interact with those files. On the iPhone, you don't necessarily see those very well, unless you use a jailbroken phone where you can actually have a file browser. But they are there, right? And so we actually have like a My Documents and a My Music and a My Photos folder inside our iPhones. But we don't really see it as we would outright see it inside Windows. What we want to do is we want to take this mydatabase.db file, copy it into our Documents folder, and then every time we interact with this app and want to save stuff and retrieve stuff from the database, we're going to be accessing that copy. So we want to figure out where the path is for that file, or where that path is going to be for that file. So we want to figure out what the path is for the Documents folder. So we're going to create a variable called document path. So we're going to say nsArray. We're going to call it document paths is equal to, and we're going to call up a function here that says nsSearch path for directories in domains. It's going to return back an array of directories. We have to specify where about we want this. So the first argument is going to be nsDocument Now be very careful of what you choose here. We're going to choose document directory. There's a documentation directory which we don't have access to. The document directory is more for super users. For the average user like ourselves, we want document directory. So be very careful of that. The second argument is what user level. Am I super user? Am I regular user? I'm a regular user. So I'm going to say ns user domain mask. So the second argument says I'm just a regular user, not super user. Third argument is, do I want to expand the tilde? So if you recall from Linux, we have a tilde, right? This is a Unix-based operating system, right? So we have tilde slash, right? Tilde representing our home directory. So we want to say, do you want to expand the tilde? We'll say yes. We want the full path. All right, so once we have this out of the way, this actually returns an array of paths. It starts off with the index array 0 being just slash my documents. And then you might have slash my documents slash my photos as being index array 1. And then index array 2 might be slash documents slash my music, right? And so on. We just want the documents directory. There's just a generic documents directory, the regular documents directory. So you just want the first index in the array. So just my documents. We'll just throw it there. So we're going to say ns string document dir is equal to document paths object at index 0. And then what we're going to do is we're going to save this inside our variable database path. So we're going to say self.databasePath is equal to documents dir string by appending. Now we're not going to use string by appending string. We're going to use string by appending path component. So string by appending path component. And we'll pass in self.database name. Now at this point, we'll pause the app here. We need to create a couple more methods, which we'll do in the next part, in order to check to see if the database file exists. If not, copy it in, and then go ahead and read data from the database. But for now, we'll stop it here, and then we'll continue this in the next part.